But none of you all should be showing up on camera, so don't sweat that. So, where did I bring this up? Okay. So, I thought I'd mention, today is about box modeling. I'm gonna do a couple of different modeling lectures. It is box modeling lecture. Look at that. That was for my first one, and I'll just name this one 001 or whatever. However, if you go to my, let me switch accounts to my actual account. If you go to the Greg Marlowe Learning page, to my channel, right? I have some older videos that I think are pretty good for like standard modeling. You just want to watch somebody model some stuff and think about concepts. They're a little bit older though. So if you're on here and you're ever trying to find anything, you can just search. Don't search up here, it'll search all of YouTube. But if you search right here, just do modeling. It's going to be these top two right here. So basic poly modeling tools and polygon modeling tools 2 Dremel. And so that's where I went over modeling a Dremel tool. There was a stretch of time where I was teaching a 3D modeling class here.
A little sloppy.
But you'll see some examples in some of this.
Another option, if I select that face and select the curve and hit Edit Mesh, Extrude, it's going to extrude all the way to the end of that edge. Right? And so that seems maybe less helpful. I don't know, because we don't have as much, like that, you know, it doesn't get that windy through it, right? And the reason is because that's just one edge going from the end of there to the end of there. If we want that to sort of adhere to that curve more, we have to add more divisions, right? You see, as we add more divisions, it starts looking a little messed up, but as we get a little higher, you'll start to see that it goes along that edge. And so if we crank this up to something, you know, high, like 100, we're actually going to get a pretty decent result. The cool thing is I can also still rotate this as long as I'm within the extrude tool to get a slightly different thing happening there as well. Now,
there's a lot more out there.
And all this is still dynamic. I can change the thickness or whatever it is I need to change on that. So after you've done all that,
so I kind of go over a whole bunch of different tools.
This still looks fine. Because then this also do it this way.
We'll look at some of these here in just a few minutes, but not all the way through. The other option is this Dremel tool.
Again,
this is actually a response.
Screw that out there, and then I'll just with these vertices. I'm going to kind of go through here and
coming in
position this
like on their first day of modeling. I gave them this picture of this Dremel tool, and you can kind of see it.
Just grabbing vertices by dragging.
They were coming in like on the first day and stuff like this, right? And this was like that's way too many faces for to start, right? Because now if you want to try to warp this thing into that Dremel tool, you have to move every one of those vertices you create, right? So it made sense to me to start talking about box modeling in the form of you are going to block it out in the simplest possible shapes at first, and then you're going to start refining that shape by adding more and more detail, right? That is the essence of how modeling works. In the process of teaching this, though, I realized that most people, like, it's hard to describe why you are fighting with your model, right? And eventually, I realized I could just break it up into these 3 areas that conveniently all start with the letter F. That will help you sort of learn what it is you're struggling with in modeling and how to make that better, right? So all models have to be successful on 3 areas, which is form, flow, and function. Let's forget about all of them except for the first one for right now, okay? What are we talking about when we're talking about form? Like we're trying to achieve a specific form. The shape. The volume, like if I'm trying to get this water bottle, right? starts with a cylinder, but there's a lot of extra little details in here that make up this is a Dr. Pepper bottle, it's not water, but you get the idea. And it's got a lot of, curves, shapes, volumes that change in order to get this shape, right? In order to get this form. The vast majority of modeling about what makes a model successful or not is, did you achieve the form you were trying to achieve, okay? So I thought we would start this, before we go into this, I'll kind of briefly go through the overview. When I say flow, what I'm talking about there is the edge flow, the way the edges route throughout your model, right? Are they wrapping around your character's arm? Are they going diagonal across your model? Like, that edge flow is going to impact both your form and your function, right? That edge flow is going to help you get a more accurate form, and that edge flow is going to determine how that model deforms later when you are putting it to use, right? And then when I say function, what I'm talking about there is what are you going to do with this model, right? If your model is just going to be a rock that's sitting on the ground, it needs to be rendered and it needs to look great, then it really doesn't matter if that rock is a gazillion faces or not, right? You're just needing to get a really nice render out of it, right? When I say function, it's like, what are you going to do with that model? Because if you're going to have a character running around in an iPad game, then the model needs to be lower resolution, it needs to be able to deform appropriately, and it needs to be, still follow the same, regular, have a correct form, right? So we're going to kind of look at some of these each and just chat about them. I like this. This is sort of the little interactive section of this class. I'm going to I have a Pinterest page of a bunch of models. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. You all will have opinions about them. I want you to tell me which ones you're finding that you think are good models and which ones you think are bad models. So I'm going to go ahead and put it up here, and I want you to tell me which one, just looking at this, which point of the model do you think is good? A puppy. Okay. How many of you like the puppy? Why? So it's appealing. Is it a good model? Let's analyze it in terms of the word form, right? Do you think that this achieved the form that the modeler was trying to achieve? So it doesn't look like a photorealistic puppy, but it is a good model, right? What's another model you think is a good model? The creepy vampire screaming thing? Yeah. So that's one of the ones that usually pops out pretty early to some people, right? It is definitely a pretty good sculpt, right? Somebody has sculpted this. How many of you think this is a good model? What makes it a good model? So there's a level of detail, right? So there's definitely a lot of if you look at right below his jaw, where his jaw hinges, there's that vein that goes through there. And then it even has some stretching of the skin on top of that vein, right? That there's a lot of detail in this model. Anybody think it's a bad model? Anybody not sure? Anybody think I'm trying to trick them? Probably think I'm trying to trick you. It's going to be hard to rig. So that brings up the function part of it, right? What is the point of this? Is this going to be a 3D print for a bust on your desk? Well, then the functionality for that is fine. It just needs detail, right? If you're going to try to animate this for a video game, is obvious here is that there's a lot of detail in this, right? Is detail necessary to make a model good? No. Because we have some pretty good examples of models in here that I personally like that are not very detailed at all, right? Look at this. So stylized, right? Yeah, it's definitely about the form. And form is a decision determined by your style. That's why I made you find style boards, because if we didn't, we would never get something like this. We would only get photorealism, because that's what you see when you look around the world, right? Your style boards mean that if this is the style you're headed for, then you are appropriately hitting the form you're trying to model, right? Let's try a bad model. Just zooming out here. Who can point out a bad model? Blue t-shirt guy. I am sorry, blue t-shirt guy. I recognized when I was giving this lecture earlier, if somebody ever stumbles across this video and they're the one who made this, and they're going to be like a little trembling bottom lip, like, they don't like my blue t-shirt guy. So if you do ever find this person who modeled this character, know that I am sorry, but this model sucks. All right, just keep working at it. You'll get better. All right.
Wait, it came up from ugly 3D models on the Google search, so I think it might have been intentional.
Maybe. Yeah. So here's the question: what makes it bad? Like, first off, how many of you think it's bad? So.
It looks like a flask has come to life.
Why is it bad?
It looks like they go back and forth between 1 and 3, so they don't have a good idea of what their shape was.
I think it's more like the chest slash, I guess, entire body is kind of round and boxy at the same time. The arms are completely round, the head's round, and the feet are all boxy, so it's just nothing's in the same.
Strangely, those feet are probably the best part of the model, and they look like these weird loaves of bread. To me, like, whenever I see a model that I think of as quote unquote bad, or that I see as problematic, it's that I can still see the underlying forms that Maya was in charge of. And the artists looked like they had no input at all on making changes to those, right? Like, I can still see the cylinder that made up the chest. I can see the 2 cylinders and the sphere that make up the arms. I can still see the sphere that makes up the head. And that's not always bad, right? Because, like, this character that I said I liked is still just a sphere for a head, right? But the difference is this feels like it's a sphere for a head because the artist was incapable of using the tool well enough to make anything else, right? It's still a sphere, not by design, but by limitation of ability, right? And when you have that, it feels like we can just notice that it doesn't feel complete, right? It doesn't feel finished. It feels like this was their first attempt. Great, we all had to go through that. Now just keep getting better. This isn't the end, right? This isn't where you are aiming to get to, right? So I think that that's the thing you need to recognize, is that a good model means that you had an intent on how you were going to achieve that shape, achieve that form. And when it feels like you have no control over that, or that you controlled it poorly, then then the model just feels like incomplete, like you didn't have any input in it, right? Now again, that doesn't mean that simple is bad, right? Because I actually really like this one. It's super simple. but it has like an element of design that makes me think all of those simple elements were intentional, right? The smoothness of this, the simplicity of this is a design decision, not something that they had to default to because they were incapable of something more, right? I love these little guys. And they are all still very heavily influenced by just a cylindrical shape, right? Right, yeah, it's not that they were like forced to keep it in that shape, it's that that shape was a decision, right?
I love the hot dog man. I think he's licking himself.
He is. He looks hungry. It's because he's got those wide eyes.
Well, did you notice about the barber shop that had boxer arm next to him?
He does have there is an arm next to him. That's a little creepy. So so I want you to kind of think about that. That a good model just means that you were attempting to get a form and you were successful at it. It doesn't, like there's no value judgment on my part on the complexity of that form, unless complexity is what you're aiming for. If you're trying to show like a ton of complexity as a point of that model. Now you see a lot of stuff like this in people's modeling demo reels, and it's almost like they're trying to overwhelm you with the amount of objects they created. And to me, this model is only moderately successful because the silhouette is still a little unclear, and there are certain areas that's maybe more noisy than necessary, right? But it's close, and you get a lot of interesting things like this chest plate that kind of comes out in the front. Like it has some simplicity to it, and then it's broken up with noise in other areas, like detail and like high levels of detail in other areas. So you get a contrast there, right? You get a contrast between these simple flat shapes and then these really detailed, intricate areas, right? But to me, it still could be a little better just because it needs, like it's hard to read, right? I can't tell, does this have 3 legs? Like what is happening there with that other one? Like, so some of that stuff just needs some clarification in the model, right? And then we get stuff like this, which to me is like an awesome model, but very simple, right? Like the resolution on this is low, but they're very specifically drawing your eye to certain shapes using color, using detail, using levels of detail, and just using like the design of the building. Like it's bigger at the top than it is at the bottom, it kind of narrows. It's just an appealing shape to look at, right? Okay, so one of the questions I get a lot about modeling is, do I need to make that one shape or two? Do I need to make that one object or 2 objects, right? And the answer to that is, I'm not sure. It's not always that easy to make that decision. However, the rule of thumb that I kind of go with is, in the real world, if that thing you were modeling were real, like in whatever style you're modeling for it, would that object be 1 object or 2 objects, right? Is it 2 pieces or 1 piece? My water bottle here has this rubber covering on it. It has glass. It has this plastic lid that unscrews. That plastic lid has a flip top. Like, the complexity that it would take to get all of that detail out of a single mesh, much less the materials, to me sounds wasteful. It's like you're wasting your time on doing it as a challenge, right? And so if a reasonably competent person could take a toolbox and take that object apart and put it back together into pieces, then each of those pieces, in theory, could be a potential separate mesh, right? Separate model, right? So a good example of this, like this thing, like look at that, like how many pieces are on that, right? Why in the world would you try to get that out of a single piece of mesh, right? Other than like some sort of like to say you did, right? That's not necessary. Like some of that stuff is super easy. It's just cylinders, right? Some of it is much more complicated, like all of the rigging underneath for where it meets the track, right? So finding your reason for doing that is no. Let me back up. So if it could be a separate model in the real world, in most cases it's probably okay to make that two models, right? That's how I have a tendency to work. It means that you're not going to have to worry about this tangled interconnection between topology, and it also means that you can manipulate them a little more easily. However, we get to stuff like this car right here, and we can see that it is not a huge number of models, right? The entire body of the car is one mesh. There's a different mesh for each tire and wheel, but the tire and wheel is all one mesh, right? And then there's a separate mesh for the rear view mirrors, primarily because it would get really messy right there at that connecting point if you had to make it one mesh, right? So they're just bashing them together, which means total this thing is 7 meshes, right? 7 different pieces of a model, right? The reason they did this is because it's probably going into something that it needs to be lower resolution, right? If you look at the topology down here, the wireframe, it's probably going into like a mobile game, or this is a little bit of an older model. Maybe it's going into some game that would not allow it to be super high resolution. So they made it one mesh, and then they faked the detail where it would be separate pieces, right? They faked the windshield being a different piece. They faked the hood being a different piece. They faked the lights being a different piece, right? And so that's really the exception. And I guess it's a little confusing at times, because when we talk about modeling in this department, a lot of times we're talking about modeling for games. And games have technical, functional, like, form, flow, and function. They have different functional needs, right? And so sometimes you make it one mesh because of that. But in most of the cases in this room, when we're doing animation for these projects we're working on right now, your goal is rendering, right? And so it would be fine to have it as multiple pieces. Having said that, sometimes that makes the pieces a little heavier. And if you have this thing right, let's try this one. Like this one right here, right? Like that's quite a bit of pieces in there, right? And you need 500 of these on like a city street somewhere. Like your Maya file is not going to function, right? You're going to try to tumble around in there, and it's going to freeze up because you have a gazillion polygons in there. So also consider maybe that car that we saw that was low resolution, maybe that's because it's far off in the background, right? Maybe we don't need higher resolution models. And in that case, you don't need that much detail in the model, right? So I'm trying to save you some effort in here. That there are good practices for how to create models, and some people will say stuff as a blanket statement that does not apply to all situations, right? So just recognize that like you have to make wise decisions, but it's okay for your models to be multiple pieces if they would be multiple pieces in the real world, okay? The way they connect together can sometimes be a little more of a challenge, right? Okay, the last little thing I want to look at, like a Pinterest page in, is the edge flow, right? So we have a tendency to call this topology or edge looping. And if we go in here and look, you'll see that like this is just a small number of the pins that exist out there for edge looping for a human character, right? There's a lot of information out there, but the way these edges work, let me go up here and show you this arm here. and we're talking form, flow, and function, right? What we're talking about right now is flow, right? The way these edges flow through your model, right? And I'm sure that a lot of you are going to make a character's arm and you're just going to make a cylinder, right? And in some cases, that's going to work great. That would not work for this character, right? Because he has such like bulging muscles, such well-defined shapes in his arm, I assume he, that a cylinder would be hard to get those shapes out of it. It'd be hard to get those forms out of it. So what we have instead are some little isolated areas where that topology changes, right? The edge flow changes in order to adapt and get a more accurate form, right? So that's where most people get hung up in box modeling, is you're trying to get a form out of your shape. You start off with a cylinder, you start off with a sphere. You're trying to get a form out of that shape, and your edge flow is fighting you, right? Like you're like, I can't get this form to come out of there, right? And so there's a couple of tools for that I thought I'd show you. One is simply being able to change the way these edges flow, right? So let's say this edge right here, right? Let's say I didn't want that edge to be going straight up and down. I wanted it to go diagonally across here. There's some manual ways of doing that. When you go to Mesh Tools, I could do the multi-cut tool, right? Blush. And then I could go from this corner to this corner and cut that, right? And then I could go from W, hold that, and hit Control Delete, and that will also delete the vertex assigned to it. And so now I have a slightly different edge flow through that model, right? And one of the cool reasons for that is if I were to insert an edge loop now, like watch what happens here when I Mesh Tools, insert edge loop. If I were to insert an edge loop here, wrong thing. If I were to insert an edge loop here, right, it goes concentrically around my model there, right? But if I insert it here, now it's going to divert that edge loop up, right? It's like a way of rerouting my edge loops, right? Now, I will say that was a couple of extra steps to get to for that though. So what I want to show you is there's actually a single button that does that as well. If you go to Mesh Tool, or I'm sorry, Edit Mesh, it's this spin edge backwards or spin edge forward, right? You'll notice it's Control Alt right or left, right, the arrows. So if I just hold Control Alt and hit my right arrow, I can sort of toggle that around, right? Yay! So I can kind of quickly go through here now and get like some completely different topology on this, right? And so if I needed like a concentric circle to go around this penguin's belly, right? Oh, sorry. There we go. That one. There we go. Vertex. I'm being kind of sloppy here, right? But now you'll see that I have this this edge loop there, right? And so if for some reason I needed to give him a little like fanny pack or whatever here, Control E. Now he's got a fanny pack. A little penguin with a fanny pack, right? Or now he's a VCR. I don't know what I don't know what to do. Teletubby, yeah. Yeah, this is the Care Bear stare. He's a Care Bear cousin. And I can also insert edge loops there, right? Edit Mesh, insert edge loops. So there are tools that allow you to do this to start getting that form. Now he's got a six-pack. So we're going to give my penguin a six-pack. Now our penguin has a beach bod. He can go out and... okay, so the point of this is to show you that there are tools out there to help you combat the challenges you're going to come up with between flow and form, right? We're going to get into some of those a little bit more later. So for example, let's say I needed to create a cylinder that grows out of this character's head. Let's do something a little different. I did a cylinder in the previous class. Let's say I wanted this to look like a keychain. That this isn't an actual penguin, it's a penguin keychain, right? So I'm going to go ahead and create a torus here. J. Rotate this around. Scale it down to give them like a little loop here, but I want that all to be one piece. I could make this significantly less pieces, maybe like that, right? I'm going to combine these two meshes together. So mesh, combine. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab these faces, extrude that down, sort of scale it in a little bit, flatten it out a little bit, right? And then just going to delete those faces. And then I will kind of do the same thing here with this side. Those four, Control or Shift, extrude that up. Flat, move it up, right? Get them in there kind of close, and delete that. And then we can pretty quickly now target weld these things together. Mesh tool, target weld, and I just pull that up, start welding these together, right?
That looks pretty cool.
Yeah. So the target weld tool is kind of how we're just merging these vertices. And now when I smooth that, it's kind of all connecting together now, right? And that's way easier than trying to extrude and manually create a torus above its head, right? So obviously this still could use a little work, but if this is what we were going for, now that's all one connected piece. I could maybe soften this edge here a little bit, round it, right? And the whole point is that I'm making topology that will allow me to get that form more easily, right? It's not everything is I don't have to like make everything manually by extruding it over and over again, right? Now eventually you may end up having a model that has topology you don't like, but form that you do like, okay? I can guarantee you ways of getting that topology. I'll go ahead and show you that now, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later. I'm not going to save my keychain head. So let's say, where is it at? Desk. Where's it at? I think it's, oh, I'm sorry. I know where it's at now. Sorry. So, models that come out, this is going to take a minute to open. Models that come out of ZBrush, models that come out of Mudbox, or models that come out of photogrammetry will have possibly some great form, but really bad edge flow. This is photogrammetry of a sculpture at Ledoux Topiary Gardens. And you'll notice, like, look at the number of faces this thing has, right? So there's lots of detail in here, but it's a form that I like, right? I like the sculpture. I took some pictures of it. So if I wanted to start getting better edge flow on this, like this is also not really usable for animation. Can you imagine painting weights on this thing, right? If I want to start getting a better edge flow, I can use one of the tools in the modeling toolkit. So if you're unfamiliar with the modeling toolkit, click this little box right there, it'll open it up. It's this quad draw tool. Really, this is just a bunch of the commonly used mesh tools, right? But we're going to use this quad draw. Before I do quad draw though, I'm going to select my squirrel and I'm going to click this little magnet up here. This makes it live, okay? When we say making something live, that means that if I created another object, started moving it around, that object is going to adhere to the surface of our live object, right? Like no matter how I try to move it, it's going to, for the most part, try to stick to the surface of our live object, right? Which has other uses, but for right now, we're going to use it for quad draw. Now, what quad draw allows us to do is just start clicking and making new points, okay? These are vertices. But there's no face associated with that yet. So whenever I'm ready for that to become a face, I just hold Shift and I can start making faces, right? Now this is a great tool primarily because it allows you to really start to understand topology. I can middle click and manipulate these edges. I can hold Control and insert another edge loop and sort of readjust that. And I can start making topology that makes sense for this squirrel. Right? Photogrammetry? Yeah. Well, you don't have to use photogrammetry, but if you have something that you actually have a physical model of, like this works to at least get you a starting point. You could always get this in there and start reworking it later. Having said that, this is also the high to low workflow that we see most commonly used in ZBrush, right? You model something in ZBrush and you just ignore the topology entirely. You're trying to make a sculpt that has good form. And you don't even think about flow or function, you just think about form. And that way, later, you can think about flow and function in the retopologizing scale, or set, right? So you get a good form first, and then you adapt and think about flow and function after that, right? Now, I'm going to show you some more stuff about photogrammetry, some more stuff about retopologizing later. I kind of thought I would show you some examples of how this works. I have a couple of models I think work pretty well this way. Sorry, miscellaneous models. I have this. So this is a cow I modeled in Mudbox. And just thinking about the form, just thinking about the sculpt of it. How many of you have either used Mudbox or ZBrush in the past? Okay. So what I will say is it's intimidating, and learning ZBrush is a lot of work. Like there's a lot of good tutorials out there, but they're all and Gnomon is one of the options for that. You can go to the Gnomon page. I have that posted on our D2L page. You can go there. There's lots of good stuff about how to use ZBrush. Mudbox, however, every one of you should be able to open up Mudbox and be able to start sculpting in that in just a few minutes. It's pretty much Maya with sculpt tools. In fact, most of the sculpt tools we have inside of Maya come from Mudbox. So I can show you that next class period. I wanted to show you this. This is the high-res sculpture of my cow from that I sort of exported out of Mudbox. You get the idea. It's very dense, right? But has a reasonable amount of detail in there, right? I'm going to go ahead and hide that. Control-H. This is my retopologized version of the cow in order to get better deformation in the areas where I need it, right? And so, like, this process is not terribly difficult. It just takes a little bit of time, right? So for organic things, you may consider using this. For hard surface stuff, you may want to still continue working in Maya. Again, there's not a set of rules. Every model you may make differently. Make it in the way that allows you to get the best form and function without without having to take forever, right? Because you also, we have a schedule you're trying to adhere to. So again, does it need to be one object or two? This was a good example. I modeled this. If you look in your outliner, it looks like there's only 3 objects here because I've grouped some stuff. So I have my locker base, right, has this part here. I have this drawer that goes inside, right, or shelf. And then I have the door, and the door is just one mesh, but it's made up of a whole bunch of pieces, and that just means I combined it. So if I get a mesh and separate that, you'll see that really what it's made up out of is this door piece, and then the little nameplate, the handle, and the combination, and each of the little hinges are each separate meshes, right? I just combined it all for animation purposes. Keep in mind, like, that's not really necessary either. I was kind of simplifying it so I could export it into games, right? Another example of this, a desk. This is something really kind of simple. And like, there's no reason to try to get all of this out of one piece, right? My seat is one piece, this is one piece, this is one piece, one piece, one piece. This grate underneath it, I merged it all together, I combined it all together, just mainly so I could resize it together. And so you kind of get the idea of what we got there, right? And again, I want to show you this one. This is kind of a neat tool. Eventually, you may get a mesh you're really happy with an edge flow or a edge count that you're not. So let's say if I went in here, mesh, and I smoothed this, and it was just like super dense, right? There's a tool that will help you reduce this. It's just under mesh. It's called reduce. And when we open that up, you'll see it tries to take out some edges. This is the same model reduced by 50%, where it chose to make those cuts are kind of all over the place. But basically, this has 50% less edges than what we had before. And if I keep cranking this number up, you'll see that it reduces my model in terms of edges, but not always that much in terms of like form, right? And I can get all the way down to something like, probably like, maybe even there, right? Without a drastic reduction or change in form. Right? If I just hit W on this now, look at that. Like, they're very similar models to you, right? Especially if I go ahead and sort of round this one and smooth it. All right. So just kind of keep that in mind. Are all of your edges actually necessary? The only real problem with that reduce is it's not doing a great job of keeping it symmetrical. There's some tools you can use to help with that. But, and again, like, you remember is anybody in here not, I think a handful of you were not in the principles classes. You're still in the older curriculum. And so those principles classes, you'll remember if you were in there, those principles classes, your first project was that bridge model, right? I gave you a whole bunch of boxes. I said, put these together in the shape of a bridge, right? And that is still a strong building block to how modeling works, right? That train we were looking at earlier was a bunch of cylinders, right? Sorry, this has got old materials on it. Let me delete those really quick so you can see this. And just assign a new material. This is the Europa Clipper, which is an actual theorized satellite that would fly over the moon of Europa and capture any vapors that come off of it. It has like all of these geysers all over it that is constantly and the gravity of that moon doesn't have enough to hold that. So it's kind of got this cloud of water vapor or some sort of vapor around it. And the idea is to fly this through that vapor to see if there's any evidence of life or the possibility of life in there, right? There's a possibility that there's microscopic organisms living in those vapors. So that's what this was for. I want you to recognize how many of these objects are just primitive objects or slight variations to primitive objects, right? Like pretty much anytime you see one of these little sticks right here, that's just a cylinder, right? That's just a cylinder there. This little canister here, still just a cylinder, just a cylinder with a cap on it, right? This shape was a little bit more complicated. It's more of a bent box, right? This is just sort of a flattened cylinder on some level. It's more like a box, I think. Even stuff like this, right? It's not really that complex of an object. It's just a box that I've kind of sort of scaled in a top corner there, right? When it boils down to it, this model looks kind of complicated. It looks like it has a reasonable number of pieces to it, but it was just strategically stacked primitive objects. Sometimes that works, right? Not all the time. Sometimes it's very easy to tell, oh, you just put some cylinders together, right? But recognize that machining things, sometimes a primitive is one of the easier shapes to make. And that's why we have monitors that are still very square. We have, and are very rectangular, right? So one of the things this is sort of my pet peeve. One of the things that really just drives me nuts. If we take this box, I'm going to go ahead and create a light in here just so we can see it. Move this over. And then we render this. Maybe turn my exposure up just a little bit so you can see it, right? If we look at that box, that edge is super sharp, right? That's it will cut you kind of edge, right? And we have a tendency in modeling to leave stuff that way, right? Because it's easier, right? Even something like this metal bracket back here that's holding these little portable walls together, even if you go there, those edges look kind of sharp. If you get close enough, you'll see that there's a little bitty bevel on there, and that little bitty bevel catches light. In fact, I can't see the bevel from here, but I can see the glare off of one of the bevels from the lights from here, right? So, one of my pet peeves is when the model looks like this, right? Even if it's just a box, let's move it over here. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it. Go in here and, let me stop that. Go in here, grab these edges, right? And under Edit Mesh, we're going to bevel that. Now it's going to bevel it way too much to begin with. I can just pull that back. I'll pull it back to probably about 0.05. I think that seems to work. Right? And now it's got that little rounded area there. I could even go smaller if I wanted to, 0.03. Right? I can add some extra segments to it so it rounds it off more. And that's not that much heavier. It's a little heavier, but not crazy, right? And I want you to look at the difference in these two renders, right? So do you see that? That little bitty highlight we're getting there, and the difference that makes? That little bitty difference makes a lot of impact on your model, right? So consider those when you're making your model. Kind of look for those things, because the other one without that just looks very computer generated to me, right? It looks like unfinished. And so this is one of the ways you can kind of get that believability in there. And it's believability you may not even recognize. If you were to show this to somebody, they may not recognize why they think that the one with the little bevel looks more realistic. It just does, right? Realistic isn't the right word. just accurate, more, I don't know, believable. So any questions about any of this? All right. So I didn't give you any answers on how you should be modeling. Oh, there's one more thing I want to show you. Sorry, I know you were really wanting me to be done. I'm not. One more thing I wanted to show you. In that form flow function, let's look just for a second about what I'm talking about when I say function, right? So I'm going to go ahead and zero this back out. I'm going to make one height division. One. And I'm going to make it really tall. So let's say this is your model, right? And the thing you'll notice is I have one span in there, right there in the middle, right? Otherwise it's just 2 polygons tall. When we're talking about function, we have to recognize that the flow choices you make, the edge loops you make, are going to impact how this object deforms, okay? So if I go in here and make a quick skeleton for this, right? I'm gonna hold down create joints, hold down X and start from the center, hold down Shift, put one right there, put it right there, right? Now if I skin this, I'm going to get, I'm going to get this result when I rotate it. See how that's like collapsing in on itself? Like that elbow is like shrinking? That's not accurate, right? It's losing volume. It's like it leaked some of its muscles and bones out, right? That's not how that would really work. We need to be able to retain that volume, and the only real way to do that is to add a couple of extra edge loops in there, right? So I'm going to undo it a few steps to before this was skinned. Yeah, there we go. And I would just go to, I'm going to go to my modeling tools, edit, mesh tools, insert edge loops. If I insert one there, maybe there, right? I could probably even put a few more in here, like a little further out here, right? Now when I skin this, let me get this. Now when I skin this model, this deformation by default is just going to look a little better. And we're still losing some volume, right? But through skinning, I could actually fix that, and I could actually retain that a little bit more. So this is something just to recognize that, like, that's why we have that, is so we have the ability to stretch or warp this more or less, right? And then when I go in, if I were to go in to paint the skin weights on this, we'll talk about painting skin weights more later, right? Joint 1, I would want that to have a little bit more. Joint 3, that's joint 2. I want these to have just a little bit more. And so now it's kind of holding its shape just a little bit better when it deforms, right? So we run into that with elbows, we run into that with knees, we run into that anywhere where you're going to get a lot of deformation or compression, okay? So that is something to consider when you're modeling your objects. So, any other questions on any of this? Okay, I'm going to add one last thing. I do not think it is possible for you to make the pretty models, the good models, without photo reference. I have had you make style sheets, I've had you make concept art, I've had you look up reference. Please, while modeling, look at image reference, okay? It will tell you whether that looks like a real thing or whether it looks like something your brain pooped out, right? Like, look up video or image reference on this. I promise, even if you can't find the image you are wanting to model or an example of what you're wanting to model, it will still inform your decisions more so they don't look generic, right? So please do that. I definitely think that's probably one of the strongest and most important modeling tools I could give you. Look at image reference. Try to use that when you are creating your models or your concept work as well. That works as well. So. All right, cool. Any questions or comments about anything? All right, Greg's going to shut up. I'm going to go ahead and in this video, I'll upload it. There'll be 2 of them up there. I'll label this one 001, so they're on there. So you can always go back and look at some of that stuff I did again. Next class period, we're going to go over sculpting, photogrammetry, and retopology. And then followed by that, we're going to look a little bit at substance and maybe chat just a bit about UVs. Okay. Lots of fun stuff. All right, cool. Is it something I should leave the thing recording for, or is it a one-on-one question? It's the what? Okay, cool. Just wanted to make sure.